Let me welcome you all here. We're going to hear from Andrew Light, our distinguished lecturer, in a minute. First, I just wanted to tell you that this is the Center for Excellence in Arts and the Humanities' fourth event in a series on sustaining the earth. And I want to thank our various sponsors, our series co-sponsors, the American Intercultural Studies Program, the Ames Historical Society, the Ames Public Library, the Bioethics Program here at Iowa State, the Brunier Art Museum, our College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Committee on Lectures, the Department of Chemical and Biological Engineering, the Department of Geologic and Atmospheric Sciences, the Department of Horticulture, the Department of Natural Resources, Ecology and Management, Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, Educational Leadership and Policy Studies, the Graduate Program on Sustainability, the Greenlee School of Journalism has kicked in, and the Institute of Science and Society, the ISU Council on Sustainability, the Iowa State University Extension to Families, the F. Wendell Miller Lecture Fund from our College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Leopold Center, Ryman Gardens, and we're funded in part through a major grant from Humanities Iowa, which brings me to the pieces of paper that might be on your seat or nearby or in your lap. Would you please fill them out by the end of the session? Those are required for our grant. In addition, if you're interested and excited after the talk or during the talk, we have some of Andrew's books for sale. Sandra, there by the bookstore? We're right at the table there? Okay. So, and the center's going to take a hefty cut. No, we're not going to. That came news to Andrew there. And so now I'm going to introduce or give the podium over to my good colleague, Clark Wolf, who's in charge of the bioethics program here at Iowa State and a member of our philosophy department. Clark?
Well, it's an honor and a pleasure for me to introduce one of my favorite philosophers, and I mean that in all of the various ambiguous senses that I might mean. I could spend a long time listing Andrew's accomplishments and the stars, and I'm not actually going to do much of that. I'll mention that he's director of the Center for Global Ethics at George Mason University, where he's a new faculty member. He's also a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C., which means he's in a think tank. I guess you can breathe in those tanks. I'm not sure. I've never experienced it. He's authored, co-authored, or edited 17 books and more important articles than I could easily mention here without boring you, though the articles are fantastic, and I have to recommend that you read them. He's previously taught at lots of cool places, like University of Washington in Seattle, New York University, University of Montana. What I really would like to say about Andrew, though, is that he's not your usual philosopher and not your usual academic. In academia, it is shockingly easy to become bound up in research that's tightly focused and bound to parochially disciplinary issues. Such single-minded focus is rewarded and in academia, and it's professionally dangerous to stray from this straight and narrow path. Some scholars don't do it, though. So Andrew has run roughshod over the traditional disciplinary boundaries or silos that so often keep us well-behaved and neatly penned in our stalls. Early in his career, he quickly became one of the most important environmental philosophers working in my field. With Brian Norton, he more or less invented the subspecialty of environmental pragmatism, a huge literature now that is sprung from early work in that area. At this point in his career, I don't think Andrew can any longer be introduced as an environmental philosopher, nor even, I think, simply as a philosopher. His wide-ranging interests, his engagement with important political issues, public issues, make him an important public intellectual who's broken free from his discipline and is no longer stalled. He now appears to be stampeding into realms of public policy and taking his place among our other important public intellectuals. So we're fortunate to have a scholar like Andrew with us, fortunate to have from him today a discussion of climate policy since Bali. So please join me in welcoming to the podium Andrew Light.
Thank you, Clark. Thank you very much. I really do appreciate that. And thank you, Joe, and thank you to both centers for inviting me. It's great to be back in Iowa. This is my second trip to Iowa State. It's particularly, I hope I don't come across as too gushing, but it really was exciting to tell my friends in D.C. that I was going to Iowa this weekend, right? You know, given what we're about to witness, because this is the mother lode. This is the birthplace of this amazing year that we've been having. Whether or not you enjoyed the attention that the rest of us had on you, I have no idea. I'm sure there was some good and bad with it, with all these kinds of things, but it was amazing. So I told people, you know, that I was coming to Iowa to start my bid for 2012, you know, begin recruiting caucus leaders, and they didn't buy it. So it's really wonderful to be back, and the hospitality's been wonderful, and the engagement with people around, you know, never disappoints. So I want to talk about climate change tonight, and I want to talk about climate change in the context of what we're going through right now, both nationally and internationally. So in the time that I've been working on environmental issues since I started doing this stuff about a little over 10 years ago now, what Clark said, this part of it was certainly true, which is that, you know, I did start really doing more traditional philosophical work, producing papers, you know, all the other kinds of things that we do. And when, like a lot of people interested in environment, and the things that were really most important to me early on were restoration ecology, which is what I talked about last time I was here, recreation of ecosystems that don't exist in particular places anymore, such as the amazing tallgrass prairie projects in Iowa and in the Midwest, and biodiversity conservation, or conservation for biodiversity. All of these projects are everything that people have been doing on these are, of course, threatened now by climate change, and not just environmental issues, but public health issues, everything else. So like a lot of environmental people, no matter where I started, we really get drawn into work on climate change of necessity. And in thinking about it, what I really wanted to do was, rather than sort of, you know, write articles about how philosophers should be more publicly engaged, which was part of the whole message of environmental pragmatism as a subfield of the larger field of environmental ethics, I thought, rather than that, I want to really practice what I preach now and try to get in there and think about participating. What is the role of an ethicist in the ongoing talks nationally and internationally on climate change? What could be the role? And what could be the contribution that we could make, commensurate with the talents and the interests that philosophers have drawn in, but also resonating with the common intuition that everyone has, which is surely true, that climate change and many of these other issues are at core bottom moral issues, and probably some of the most important moral issues of a non-military engagement form that I think we will ever see. And in that sense, the arguments that people make, from Gore to Thomas Berry to others, that climate change is the deciding moral issue of our set of generations currently existing in relationship to the future, I think is completely right. And I think it's something that everyone gets, regardless of whether or not they've taken a philosophy class or, you know, done advanced work in it or not. This, however, was brought home to me, and this is why I call this climate ethics after Bali. Because to ramp up, the first major thing that I did in trying to insert myself into the forums where the decisions were being made, was to go to the UN Framework on Climate Change meeting, which is the organization which oversees the Kyoto Treaty process, to go to their last big meeting, which was in Bali last December. And if you know what was going on at the Bali meeting, that is where all the signatory parties, right, of the Kyoto Treaty, which is called the Congress of the Parties, has happened every year since well before Kyoto, come together and they start talking about, you know, looking at how far they've come and looking towards the future. The Bali meeting was particularly important because they were looking forward to Copenhagen meeting, which will happen not this coming December, but next December. And at Copenhagen is where we hope a successor to the Kyoto Protocol will be decided. It will be an extremely important international event with respect to the history of attempts to do something on climate change. So at Bali, they were producing what's called the Bali Roadmap. And the Bali Roadmap would lay the bare bones, the groundwork for what the Copenhagen Treaty will look like. Now, I went to this meeting, and because of by luck and by accident, I was able to sit down with John Kerry, Senator John Kerry, at this meeting. And this was really important because it was supposed to be the case that a big delegation from the U.S. House and the Senate were going to go to that Bali meeting with one big message. And the message was, hold on, world, right? Don't worry that we have actually been adamant, our country has been the biggest roadblock to doing anything with respect to a significant international agreement on climate change. Don't worry, because things will change in a year, you know. And at that point, the only candidate who seemed remotely viable, and remotely is, I think, the key operative term here, who was an active climate skeptic on either side at the time, was Fred Thompson, right? So that was, outside shot would actually get a president who was an active climate skeptic. So, you know, hold on, world, we will be there with you. And the Republicans took the opportunity of the week of the Bali meetings to have major filibusters on an important piece of environmental legislation in the Senate, and then also cause some trouble in the House. So the entire congressional delegation, which was supposed to go there and represent us, people who were not climate skeptics, people who really wanted to join the international discussion on this, were not able to go, with one exception, and it was John Kerry. Because he's a very, the guy has a lot of integrity. He also has a lot of money. So he's able to fly into Bali for 6 hours, right? Flies to Indonesia for 6 hours, and he gives a couple major important addresses. And they were brilliant, and they really did help. And it was between Kerry giving his addresses and talking about, don't worry, world, America will be there with you, and then Gore coming later in the week after he'd accepted the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo, it kind of saved American integrity for just one more year, and I think only one more year, with respect to this larger UN process. And during one of the big messages that John Kerry had was, the moral dimensions. And he kept saying, climate change is the moral issue of our time. And he said this, press conferences and private meetings with negotiators, all this kind of stuff. So I got lucky enough to sit down in a meeting with him at the very end of what must have been an incredibly exhausting day with him, just an hour before he left town to fly back to D.C. And we had met once before. I'm sure he did not remember this, but his handlers told him to remember it. And so he comes up to me, and he's very big man, imposing sort of individual. He's like, Andrew, good to see you. Good to see you. You're an environmental ethicist. What are you doing here? It's like, but dude, you were just sort of saying, like, it's the moral issue of our time. Like, why wouldn't an ethicist be at the meeting where we're talking about the moral issue of our time? And that's where I sort of realized, right, this is, rather than just sort of being my own sort of idiosyncratic, I want to try to sort of show what a philosopher can do in a process like this. This is important because our discipline and, partly for our own fault and probably but not entirely, had not yet proven, right, what philosophers can really contribute to this, or what really should be the depth of the discussion of the ethical dimensions of climate change. So that's what I want to talk about tonight, is sort of how I sort of foresee the territory, where I think the gaps are in the way that we think about the ethical dimensions of climate change, what I think are some of the precedents for how we could change the way we do, and I think the precedents do come from other areas of applied ethics, and then show you a little bit of sort of what's happened most recently and where the sort of research is sort of going now, and the projects I'm involved in, which I think try to fulfill this. First talk about, I'm going to talk about a field of ethics which I think is completely engaged in, on the ground, life and death questions, which is not just producing, the common stuff that all academics of all styles produce really well, which is, very good, rigorous articles and books. And that's clinical bioethics. The bioethicists who will help you, hopefully, when we're all faced, most of us will be faced with these terrible decisions of deciding whether or not to, say, disconnect, for example, a loved one from life support, after an illness or an accident or something else. These are the folks, trained ethicists or people who have significant ethics training, who help to make those decisions, and I think they do a very good job. I'm going to talk about that, pull out what I think are some interesting lessons of the development of clinical bioethics over the years, and then I'm going to make a case for what I want to call, then I want to look at, secondly, the current state of the literature on climate ethics, with which Clark Wolf here has contributed greatly to, as have a lot of my colleagues at various places I've been. Look at that, and then try to make a case for a kind of a new branch of of climate ethics, which I'm going to call clinical climate ethics, which is modeled after clinical bioethics, but it will have some important differences because it's about trying to tackle a problem which is global in scale, which is something that is going to be influenced by the decisions that all of us make and the institutions that represent us will make, rather than the decisions that often are made by individuals. And I think it really does certainly change things. So one other piece of background, and this sort of goes to what Clark was talking about before. The way that I have approached a lot of, from the beginning, questions of applied ethics, ethicists who talk about business ethicists, people who talk about engineering, people who really extend the work of ethics to these particular other fields, I always want to know why we do it. What is the point of it? They're not the most sexy or attractive philosophical questions out there. They're certainly not the ones that are necessarily going to shoot you to the top, and get you a job in the best in the Ivy League, right? So what is sort of really that attracts us to these questions, and what do we hope to do with them? And I want to say there's 4 reasons, and I'll come back to these through the talk. The first reason that I think most people would give is a pretty traditional one. We do applied ethics to contribute to a philosophical literature primarily of interest to other philosophers and students, and that's kind of why a lot of philosophy is done. But there are these other reasons that I think also follow from this. Secondly, assisting other professions, right, in understanding their moral problems and helping them to contribute to the resolution of those problems. So we help engineers to understand more, for example, about the importance of whistleblowing, the importance of bucking the system, of calling a halt to projects. Because if you don't, then terrible consequences can happen, and there's a moral responsibility for the trust that you have as a member of that profession. Thirdly, I think it's important that we try to do practical ethics or applied ethics in such a way that we assist policy advocates and decision makers in addressing moral problems in a specific realm of moral concern. And so we have to deliver the kind of work that we do in a fashion that makes sense to them, that helps them in some way. One of the interesting kind of experiences I had in the last couple of years was working with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration on helping them to come up with some protocol for what to do in the field, for example, when they're facing a catastrophe like an oil spill, what to do in the field when the regulations don't give them any instruction, where they are really having to make a choice. And what they're making is really a moral choice about, are they going to, in responding to a catastrophe, going to close off some possibilities for, say, the use of a natural resource in the future, or open them up. And there's lots of interesting cases that we could talk about on this later. But I think it's important for us to be able to say something about that. And then finally, improve and influence the public understanding and discussion of moral issues concerning current affairs. And I think in a certain sense, and we can talk about this later if you want, people who do ethics have a moral responsibility, I believe, to do this. And if we don't take up that responsibility, I don't know who does. The way that I've sort of, the pragmatism stuff that Clark mentioned earlier has come out in a couple different books that I've worked on. And essentially my intuitions are that if we have that there is a problem if we're only doing applied ethics in the traditional way we do other forms of philosophy, if we only communicate to other philosophers, doesn't seem to me to be that seems to be a problem intrinsically for the field if it can't go beyond that. And I don't think that's not a criticism of the more foundational work, which I'll talk about later in respect to climate change that some people are doing, but just to say that we ought to have another dimension to environmental ethics, to agricultural ethics, that is really to speak to other problems. And more so, I want to say that the claim is simply that suggests at least, like I said, part of the contributions to be to them. And this is kind of the part of the talk where I'm talking to the few other philosophers in the audience. So they might be. I was worried that they might be concerned with my approach here, but the rest of you hopefully will not be. So let's talk about clinical bioethics and why I think it's an important thing to look at. The field of bioethics itself, or as we sometimes refer to it as medical ethics, is just that field of applied ethics which looks at ethical issues involved in medicine and the life sciences more broadly. So especially now, there's substantial literature. Oh, thanks. There's substantial literature where people have something substantial to say about, say, stem cell research or and not just doctor-patient relationships, but these broader sort of issues of policy. And you could trace that work back to the 19th century, really, of people saying substantial things, probably even much further than that. Interesting philosophical stuff that's been said about medicine. But really more recently, and there's lots of explanations for it, part of it was a push by insurance companies. Part of it was just something that came intrinsically from the medical profession itself. There's what's called clinical bioethics. And that's this form of bioethics, but done in a clinical setting. And I often say to graduate students in philosophy who sort of say, what should I sort of work on if I'm going to get a PhD in philosophy? And, I'll ask them what they're interested in. But if they they don't care. Like if their only interest is getting a job, and they have no interest at all in what they write on, if that's the only sort of the way that they're making the decision, I say, well, go into bioethics. And the reason is because depending on how you look at it, there are more jobs in bioethics now than there are people looking for those jobs. And that's really unusual for philosophers, where we definitely have a problem. We don't have enough jobs for the smart people who are trained in these fields. And part of the reason is because a lot of the people who do clinical bioethics, where their main work is not, writing articles or doing, direct research, is they're working, like I said before, in those hospital rooms, on those ethics boards, in not only teaching hospitals at universities, but just major hospitals in the area. And there's lots of really interesting stuff that comes out of that, in addition to the good that they do with respect to helping to give advice to people. One way to sort of think about the evolution of clinical bioethics, and I'll come back to this as I go through this talk, is that there's sort of different factors, and we'll call those the why, when, who, where, and how factors that leads to the emergence of this form of philosophy that's really done outside of philosophy departments, primarily. And these all respond in some ways to those audiences I talked about before. Not the other philosophers and their students, but the policymakers, the members of the allied professions, in this case medicine, or the public itself. And those are things like, clearly the necessity to respond to life and death issues. There is a life and death issue before you. We'll go back to the example of having to choose whether or not to terminate life support on a loved one. A decision has to be made now. We know this is a moral question, and there are better and worse ways to make this decision, and that's what that person is there to help you with. When it's done, at that critical moment, when there's an emergency, when the kind of not the full breadth of reflection we normally think about as appropriate to a philosophical question, which is hundreds of years, is not available to us, but it really is much, much more shorter than that. Where it's done in a public setting, and so it has to be something that's publicly accessible and not something that is just going to be something you communicate to a specialized audience. Who does it? Not just philosophers, but of course also doctors, who now all of them have to do substantial training in medical ethics. There are critiques of it that are out there, for sure, the different models, but a lot of the best work in clinical bioethics is done by doctors who then have some training. And then how? In response to an opportunity to engage these individual problems and also questions of public policy. And it's a really interesting success story. So when substantial issues, say, on stem cell research, take a year ago year ago in November, there was a major discovery at Kyoto University and another university in the US where we found out that it was possible to possibly create stem cells in something without using fetal tissue, right? Major breakthrough, still controversial about whether or not it really is the breakthrough that people were looking for. But immediately you turn on National Public Radio, you've got bioethicists commenting on this, right? And talking about it. Partly because of the way in which we've overlaid moral questions on top of these issues, and because we have this ban on stem cell research today in the US, but also partly because intrinsically this is a moral question. We see this in other areas. And the interesting thing is how successful this area of philosophy has been in becoming a kind of a go-to of a range of professions that have something substantial to say. So one would not dream of holding significant hearings on cloning, on stem cells, on these kinds of issues in the House or the Senate without including a bioethicist on those panels. Now, we don't see anything like that with respect to environmental ethics, not yet. I think we see little glimpses of it around, but for an issue, again, the environmental problems we face, which also seem to be intrinsically moral questions, And if you doubt that they're intrinsically moral questions, just think about how easily they become political fodder, right? So Sarah Palin has been lambasted by the Environmental Defense Fund for her, first of all, promoting aerial hunting of wolves, right? Secondly, fighting the listing of polar bears under the Endangered Species Act, and thirdly, fighting the listing of beluga whales under the Endangered Species Act. Environmental Defense has turned all three of these issues into commercials, which are now running in various battleground states. And to say that obviously hot-button political issue is not also a moral question would be absurd. It's there, but this is not, we've not yet come up with the body of philosophical work that really helps to pull those issues up away from, I think, the prurient ways they can be used in a political debate and make them into a sort of more reasoned discussion of their moral, the moral dimensions of them. My favorite, one of my favorite, I should say, bioethicist, because he's my colleague at the Center for American Progress, but even before he's my colleague, he was one of my favorite guys in the bioethics literature, Jonathan Marino, who's a pragmatist in bioethics, talks about this he says, when you're doing bioethics in this kind of public setting, you just have to change the way you do this kind of philosophy. A couple quotes from him. He says, the views that cash out in medical practice do so influenced as much by the problems at hand as by any prior theoretical view that participants bring to the table. In other words, it is rare to hear an ethics committee member in a laboratory or hospital setting explicitly appeal to the problem of balancing autonomy and beneficence, for example, which are two of the big topics that bioethicists have historically written on. Rather, the facts of the case, the medical uncertainty, the suffering involved, its human importance, the legal and administrative complexities, and other more immediate factors tend to overwhelm theory. So we have to sort of figure out beforehand how we're going to think about these issues in a good, rigorous, moral way before they become critical and they do overwhelm our ability to rationally think through them. Put bluntly, he says, those who leave the seminar room for the hospital conference room will drastically change their professional role or soon find themselves unwelcome or ineffective in the latter setting. So this is a lesson I think that's been internalized by the bioethicists really, really well, and I think it's the kind of lesson that we need to think about in a clinical version of climate ethics, a version of climate ethics that really is working on the front lines. The way I put this is an assertion. If we're concerned with influencing policy advocates, decision makers, and the public, all those people embodied in that slide, the reasons 2 through 4, the most successful area of applied ethics is bioethics, and so we ought to try to duplicate their successes where we can, but also learn of their failures, and there are some interesting failures by this crowd. So let's just talk about the current state of climate ethics then, and which I think is very good and very promising. In fact, climate ethicists have done a great job of avoiding a lot of the traditional problems that I have, in previous work, have accused environmentalists in general of avoiding. And I won't go into the details on that, so I'm going to skip most of this, because you can buy the book. It's right over there, right? But basically, the story is this. Long about the early 1970s, we started forming a field of environmental ethics as a separate new form of applied ethics. And I think that it's by and large gone down a bad path. And one way of putting this is that most of the folks who have been doing environmental ethics have thought that we needed to come up with an entirely new way of doing ethics, untethered from the millennial history of Western philosophy in order to achieve that. And if you want to ask me about this later, happy to talk about it. But I think that's been a big problem, partly because it's created an even more esoteric way of talking about ethical questions, one that does not resonate with the way we normally talk about ethical issues in arenas of public policy, right, in decision-making areas. So just trust me that I'm right on that, right? But we with two colleagues from Britain, John O'Neill and Alan Holland, we sort of put this critique in this book. That's this nice short book. It's a very short book. That sort of explains this. So we'll leave that ahead. Now, we look at the current terrain of people talking about climate change. The great news is they completely avoid this problem. Because by and large, the people who've been working on climate change, ethics and climate change, have been people who have not gone down that sort of idiosyncratic route of the history of environmental ethics, but instead have been working within traditional areas and been doing very good work. And just a few examples, I'll just not explain what these mean. I'll come back to two of them. But the two oldest, sort of most senior members of the philosophical world who have looked at these questions, Henry Shue, who's now at Oxford, Dale Jameson, former colleague of mine at NYU, have made interesting distinctions between how we look at emissions, subsistence emissions you need to emit in order to survive versus luxury ones. There's a big difference between the person driving the Hummer, right, and the person who's expelling emissions in order to grow food. There just is a big difference. I will pick out of here Clark Wolf. He's done wonderful work on taking a model of distributive justice that we go back to with John Rawls and showing how that can be informative in talking about global warming. I'm going to come back to these two later, Tim Hayward and Steve Gardner, who talk about some of the other moral complexities involved in climate change. And then another colleague from the UK, Simon Caney, who's really at the forefront of what is a much broader discussion and a very important discussion about human rights and climate change, increasingly one of the major ways in which we talk about the moral dimensions of climate change. If I were to sort of name the two ways in which, when I was at the meetings in Bali, other than grand rhetorical statements like Kerry was making, the really specific arguments that people were making that seemed to cut across, national origin, developed versus developing countries, that really seemed to resonate with everyone. There were two common kind of ways of talking about climate change and morality. One was obligations to future generations, one of the most powerful arguments we can sort of make, and then secondly, talking about human rights in climate change. And this especially is important when we sort of think about all the other dimensions of climate change that exacerbate a lot of the problem. If we were to think about, access to clean water and food and shelter, as a human right, if we were to think of these in terms of human rights, and of course climate change exacerbates all of these. And like I said, these people largely work within the main traditions of philosophy, and I think their work is good for that. The claim I'd make then there is that the moral framework of climate ethicists is more relevant to climate policy because all these kinds of things, we have forums that already talk, for example, about human rights. It's a going concern. It exists in the policy agenda. To bring in climate change to talk about that, to talk about the importance of climate change with respect to human rights makes sense because we already have these forums in which we have accepted them as a legitimate place to discuss human rights in the UN, in national institutions as well. To talk about climate change, for example, and energy security, right? Children's health. All of these ways of talking about climate change resonate because they are already going into a forum which already exists. And it's no accident that when the Democrats took over the Senate now 2 years ago, one of the first things that Barbara Boxer did, who's the senator from California who's head of the Environment and Public Works Committee in the Senate, she created 2 new subcommittees on climate change and packed them in to give them mandates that really resonated with these other areas of policy. So one is on public health and specifically children's health and climate change, and the other one is on energy security. And it's not only strategically and politically smart, but it also just makes sense given that these questions are all affected by climate change. Here's an example of, I think, some of that really good work. And I'll go through it, what I think is good about it, and then also start pointing out what I think are the limitations of this work, why we of necessity need to go beyond it. So this is my former colleague at University of Washington, Stephen Gardner, who's written one of the best articles that's yet been done on intergenerational justice, on obligations to future generations and climate change. It's a wonderful piece of philosophical work. 2 basic theses. The first one is that it's going to be difficult for us to come up with some kind of way of addressing global warming because of the spatial dimensions of the problem. His second was going to involve the temporal dimensions. And what are the spatial dimensions of the problem? Things that most of us should be familiar with. The causes and effects, right, of climate change are dispersed throughout the globe. It's not a point source form of pollution. It's not about making sure that the fertilizer off of that field doesn't go into that riparian system because the carbon that we emit goes into this global problem. And then it persists, of course, over time, depending on the source for decades, if not centuries. There's a fragmentation of agency. We're all producing this problem. It's not caused by one person. You can't lock up one guy and saying, you're causing global warming, or that bad country over there is causing global warming. We can certainly talk about disproportionate sources of emissions. We do. but we really are talking about a tragedy of the commons. We've got a commons, which is the atmosphere, and we're overloading it, and we're not sort of making people pay for taking a disproportionate form of it. And then there don't seem to be global institutions that exist to address these problems. And on the one hand, you can say, well, the UN is, in fact, an institution that's organized to address this problem. And I'd be happy to talk about, I've got a whole other talk that I have about what I think is wrong with the Kyoto process and what I think is wrong with the UN. But in this sense, just think of this, is that the UN is having an institution that deals with a peacekeeping mission, for example, is much, much different than having an institution that deals with a problem like this. Because it isn't about going into one country. It isn't about responding to a particular crisis in one place. It's talking about a global problem. And it's talking about a global problem where there is this unfortunate, we'll see this in a second, unfortunate language of there being winners and losers, that some of us will benefit and some of us from climate change, at least in the short run. And so it's not in our interest to all work to some kind of solutions. Second thesis is a temporal thesis. And that, again, the causes and effects are temporally dispersed over multiple generations. Gardner at one point sort of says this creates a kind of an intergenerational arms race where why should we be giving up our ability to grow our economy and get all the things that we want for the future? Why are we sort of giving up for them? We can imagine why we might be doing it for our kids, but what about, 5, 6, 7 generations into the future? Given that we can sort of assume some kind of economic growth, and this creates a competition between generations. Again, there's this fragmentation of agency. We're working at odds with each other across time scales, and we don't really have a good track record for global institutions for dealing with that kind of long-term temporal problem. It is so difficult. I mean, look at Yucca Mountain as my favorite example of this. This is the site in Nevada, very politically controversial, where we want to come up with a place for long-term disposal of nuclear waste, which is absolutely essential if you have any aspirations of using nuclear power as part of the way that we sort of grow ourselves out of, our reliance on carbon fossil fuels. The facility at Yucca Mountain, after a very long process, was designed by the Department of Energy and administered by the EPA to be safe for 100,000 years. Right? So you've got a facility that purports to be able to lock this stuff up, to be able to take the most dangerous of the nuclear radiotides that exist in this byproduct of energy and nuclear weapons production and make it safe. The National Academy of Sciences did a study with some of the top engineers in the country and came to the conclusion that, in fact, this was insufficient, that what you needed was a facility that was going to be safe for 1 million years. Right? Now, this is outside the scope that we've ever thought about in terms of being able to come up with a regulatory answer to a problem. And this is the kind of problem that it's not at all certain that we could ever come up with some solution. But outside of those, we think about these global problems, it's hard to imagine these things. The conclusion that Gardner gets us is because of these spatial and temporal conditions of global warming, like I said, it'll be hard to address our moral responsibilities. There will be, whenever we see a temptation to back away from our moral responsibilities, we'll try to do it. And he puts it this way. There's scientific uncertainty about the precise magnitude and distribution of effects of climate change, particularly at the U.S. national level. One reason for this is the lack of trustworthy data about the costs and benefits of climate change at the national level. Perhaps some nations wonder we might be better off with climate change than without it. More importantly, some countries might wonder whether they will at least be relatively better off than other countries. So there will be temptation to avoid what we might think is the moral responsibility. Now, I think Gardner is completely right in this conclusion. He has identified the moral complexity of the problem. What I don't find in Steve's work, although I admire it greatly, is any gesture towards then what do we do, right? And so you read Gardner's wonderful philosophy and you get depressed, right? Really depressed. And it's like, oh, well, let's all go down to the bar, like what the hell, right? There is no way we're going to sort of find our way out of this. My view, and I think this is the view that we really, we need to sort of take and sort of orient ourselves towards a new approach to these problems, is rather than accepting this conclusion as an inevitable corruption of the policy outcomes or a necessary influence on public opinion, let's use this understanding of the difficulty of it and then find the tools that will give us the ability to respond to particular audiences in the same way that a good clinical bioethicist talks to the people he's or she is working with, finds out what's important to them, what they think is important to the person that they're making a decision for, in the case of the end-of-life decision, and then crafts particular messages around those particular conditions. So that's the kind of, I think, the arm that we can imagine would be the wing of clinical climate ethics. Now, I'll come back to this later. I think there'd be weaker and stronger versions of this kind of critique. So part of the weaker version is, in addition to this work, we ought to do something else. The stronger version will be that sometimes this work might actually be the wrong way to go. And I'll give an example of that in a second. But just to put this in context of the clinical bioethics message again, remember that, when do we do clinical bioethics? When we're confronted with a problem right now. How, it's the when, where, how, why, those kinds of questions. We're there with climate change. We're absolutely there. And just a couple sort of reasons why I think we're there. We're certainly there when it comes to the why it's done, the necessity to respond to life and death issues, and when it's done. And we've seen this even more acutely on the national stage after that Bali meeting, right? And this is, again, how this is climate ethics after Bali. Because after the Bali meeting, where once again the United States tried to derail some kind of significant advance towards a successor to the Kyoto Protocol at the Copenhagen meetings, once again did that. The scientific community really got over what has been a great deal of unease that they've had to become strong advocates on this issue. And for reasonably so, right? The scientific community has sort of said, look, we'll do the science, but the policy stuff is up to you, because that's not the role. The scientist is not the advocate on these questions. But I mean, so egregious were things finally after the Bali meeting that we started getting the strongest statements we've yet seen from the scientific community. So Rajendra Pachauri, the head of the IPCC, said, what we do, after seeing what happened in Bali, what we do in the next 2 or 3 years will define our future. Incredibly strong. And it doesn't mean we solve the problem in 2 or 3 years, but if we don't get on the stick and get down the road to a significant solution to the problem, then we're in deep, deep trouble. Jim Hansen, probably the dean of, certainly the American contingent of scientists working on climate change at NASA, put it this way in a really dramatic paper that started to be circulated last January. We need to reduce from today's atmospheric CO2 load of about 385 parts per million down to 350. And so far, we've only talked about capping it, right, at 400, at 425, at 450 in terms of these international agreements. Hansen says we actually need to shrink it. We need to go down to 350. We are already too high to maintain the climate to which humanity, wildlife, and the rest of the biosphere are adapted. This target must be pursued on a timescale of decades. And this, again, is much faster when we compare that to the way in which we normally think about the time frame of philosophical interventions. We're also there, I think, with respect to the how, right? We have this opportunity to engage the public because I think we're ready for it. We're certainly ready for it in other parts of the world. I'm convinced that we're ready for it in this country now. Here's a figure, and I'll come back to this, from a big polling project that I'm now involved with co-investigators from George Mason University, Ed Maibach, and another one, Tony Lershowitz, who runs the Yale Climate Change Project. Here's some polling that Tony did just a couple years ago on American public support for climate change policies. Very high, much higher than most people think it is. And there's some interesting reasons why the polling on climate change up till now has been largely discounted. The Pew polls have often sort of said there's really not enough public support, but I really think we've got some ways in which we can explain that and sort of see that. It's really high, if you can't read this, for U.S. reducing emissions, signing on to some version of the Kyoto Protocol, increase of CAFE standards, of the sort of automobile standards, on down the line, until you get to something like a tax, and then it drops off, because we don't like taxes, right? Joe the plumber doesn't like taxes. No one else likes taxes either, right? So that's why that holds off. From polling we did last week on a study, which I'll explain at the very end, it doesn't look like, and this is the first survey ever to show this, and it's amazing in the context that we're in now, right? The first study ever to show that, in fact, climate change is an issue that may be a decider for a lot of people. It won't be the top issue, it won't be the single most issue, but one of several important issues, and you want to pay attention to lean McCain voters and lean Obama voters, the two people in the United States who haven't decided how they're going to vote yet, right, is an important issue for them, right, at least. But it is important. The 64 and 75 numbers there, that in fact it's one of a cluster of important issues, and everybody predicted. In fact, my think tank, the Center for American Progress, decided not to be the vehicle to release the figures on this data before we got it, because they were convinced, as were we in fact, that we would see that climate change was not an issue in this campaign at all among undecided voters. And we were wrong. In fact, we've got a plausible case that it is an important issue of one of several. So this is the time to start acting. This is the moment, this is the opportunity, because if the banking meltdown hasn't prevented people from seeing this as an important election issue, right, then I don't want to wait for the thing that really will knock this, out of people's consciousness. Let's go back to another example, and then I'm going to push that critique for climate ethics a little bit harder, and then show you where I'm going. This is a wonderful article by Tim Hayward, who's at the University of Edinburgh, and it's again that work on human rights, and it's again work on human rights and climate change. And basically, the point of this article is this: from earlier philosophical work on climate change, we have seen people sort of talking about rights to pollute. So what do you balance? How do we sort of think about how we're going to allocate carbon credits in a national cap-and-trade system or in an international system of some form of cooperation? And we often talk about it as a kind of a right to pollute. And Hayward has some wonderful analysis here to say that that's kind of a strange way to sort of we sort of think about positive rights, rights to vote and rights to assembly and stuff, but we don't really think about rights to pollute. We don't. We sort of think about, well, when I was a kid, we used to throw trash, right, out of the window, right, when we're driving down the highway. We did, get rid of the fast food bag when we're on a long family trip. We'll throw it out the window, right? And we now, and then we saw the Indian crying, and we were moved, and then so we stopped doing that. Because we thought we really don't have a right to pollute. So this is strange. So parts of the critique are that carbon emissions shouldn't be an object of human rights. Because a decent human life doesn't inherently depend on them like other kinds of things we think. A decent human life depends on emissions are a finite resource, so it's inappropriate to grant an open-ended right to them. And systems of international level, especially of justice international level, when we're talking about the Kyoto level discussions, we ought to really be talking about fundamental rights, which is the language that we use when we're talking about intervention and genocide. We're talking about fundamental questions, not things like right to pollute. So instead, he wants to create this area he calls ecological space, or ecological utilization space. We don't have a right to pollute, but we all have enough right to the common biosphere to live a decent life. That's what we have a right to. And it's a very good piece of philosophical analysis and very persuasive. So it's defined as here a fundamental right of each individual to an equitable share of the planet's aggregate natural resources and environmental services that are available on a sustainable basis. And he thinks, and which is, I think, a very interesting proposal, but then his conclusion is the one that worries me. And I think, because I think he's quite right about this, while the policy implications of this framing of the problem are not immediately apparent, such a framework could be normatively preferable. And, certainly it would be normatively preferable given all the weaknesses of talking about a right to pollute. But it's the really latching on is the way, do we really want to latch on in terms of immediately what will ethicists do on the climate issue? Really want to sort of really latch on to proposals for which we really don't have a way of framing them for any kind of policy solution. So that becomes my concern. So remember I said there are stronger and weaker versions of the call for a climate ethics. The weaker version of the challenge is, well, okay, fine. If we're going to go this ecological utilization spaces route, then we have to put as much time into finding some way of first of all, implementing this, making it cohere with either national or international regulatory frameworks, and that will require a lot more information on how you frame it in a public debate. The stronger version of this challenge, right, is that this might just confuse the issue unnecessarily. Even though it gets to what I think is a very good moral point, it will be very confusing at an institutional level, and given the kind of time frame of action that we're talking about. And so insofar as we might be able to talk about the right to, even so the right to pollute might be not the best way of framing this kind of issue in terms of the moral rigor of it, it might at the end of the day get you more traction in the short run. So that's the one way of sort of framing that. So bring this around now full circle to what I think a clinical climate ethics, or at least one project that would be compatible. So this is not going to be exclusive. Actually, I really hate this slide, but nonetheless. This is what happens. You Google, planet sick, and you get, this is the first thing you get. So but basically, what I now want to do is just run through a little bit of data on this project that I mentioned before with George Mason and the Center for American Progress and Yale, where we're sort of doing something that I think amounts to one version of what a clinical version of climate ethics would look like, a project that might fit that bill, in addition to, and not to as a replacement for this other work I've talked about, but in addition to it, to strengthen it. So the premise to this work, some of you will know the work of George Lakoff, right? The linguist at UC Berkeley, who's done a lot of work with Mark Johnson, a philosopher at the University of Oregon, on the moral framing of public policy questions. And there's been some really interesting work done there, which is, I think, a lot of it, by and large, accepted as an approach, even though people sometimes have a lot to disagree with Lakoff's conclusions. Especially when he says things like, hold your baby closely so they don't become a Republican. Probably, that's just not sound advice, right? So, even though you should hold your babies closely, right? So, but that's not the reason. So the approach here, and this was initial work done by Tony Leicherwood at Yale, was to basically confirm the suspicion. Is it that a moral framework, a crudely put moral framework like egalitarian versus hierarchicalist versus a few other options, is that a good determiner of what people's attitudes are about climate change? And it turns out that we've got very good evidence that it is the best determiner for attitudes on climate change. A stronger correlation than any kind of socioeconomic status or party affiliation, right, or race or gender or anything else, right? How people respond to other questions about how they feel about, fairness with respect to Social Security or, tax policy or anything else that has nothing to do with climate change, that is a strong correlation to what they think about the different moral dimensions of climate change. What moral dimensions? These three. What we want to call the urgency gap, the temporal gap, and the spatial gap. So the need to act now, it's an urgent problem. We got to do something about it now, and that we got to get there in order to respond to the warnings that the scientists, I said, are giving us. The temporal gap, when will things go wrong? And that's a strong determiner on how the policy response goes. Is it going to be a problem that we're going to see down the road, or is it a Katrina-like disaster around the corner kind of worry that people have? And then spatial gap, who does it happen to? Are we okay and other people are in trouble, or are we all sort of facing a common risk? So I'll go through some slides on each of those gaps, and this won't take very much time at all. The data I'm going to show you is from 06 and 07, and then at the very end I'll show you some more data that we just collected as part of this project from last week. The slides from 2006 are from a study that was done, that Tony did, on polling people who's on An Inconvenient Truth, right? Did the film An Inconvenient Truth actually actively affect people's, attitudes about climate change? So you want to ignore all the blue bars on these, because these are people who went in and said, "Oh, right, I'm convinced." You want to look at the white bars. That's the people who didn't watch the movie, and that's just baseline public attitudes, right, about these different moral gaps. So urgency. Here's the question: life on Earth will continue without major disruptions only if we take immediate and drastic action to reduce global warming. 20% say now, 19%, almost 20% in 10 years, so about 40% there. And then just the next year, in 2007, sorry these slides are a little bit blurry, but in just 1 year, a 10% jump in 1 year of people who are willing to sort of say they strongly agree with it's happening now and it's an urgent problem. And that statistically is a huge jump, right, on an issue. And a lot of things are happening in that time period, And it turns out that a lot of the events, it wasn't just one issue. It wasn't just Katrina. It wasn't just, polar bears. It wasn't just these different kinds of arguments. People responded to different kinds of things. No one kind of argument was getting them there. Temporal gap. when do you think global warming will start to have dangerous impacts on people around the world? And again, we see the 20% and almost 20% on the now and in 10 years. And again, 2007, another jump of 10%. Very encouraging. The only problem is when we look at the spatial gap. And here is the data from 2007. And we're waiting now to sort of see what's going on this year from the current round of polling that we're doing on this. But the worries are first encouraging in some degrees. If you want to pursue a very traditional environmental ethic concern for plants and animals, that's very encouraging. But in terms of obligations towards people, the claim is it's really something that affects people far away from us, and it won't hit us. Only very few people, relatively speaking, are concerned that's going to happen here. Which again is exactly that problem that Gardner brought up. Right? It becomes a reason to take the moral low road, right? Or even the moral, I think, prurient road, which would be assuming that we can protect ourselves and the rest of the world won't have to worry what comes later. Now, I won't read through this whole thing, but basically, this simply just summarizes what I told you at the beginning, that the strongest correlate, this is all part of proof that the strongest correlate for how we understand people's attitudes towards global warming does turn out to be in moral dimensions. It's that opening for the moral arguments. And this means that the messages that we make have to be tailored. If you're going to take on this problem in these moral dimensions, they have to be as tailored as the clinical bioethicist in the room with this family as opposed to that family as opposed to that family, talking about this patient versus that patient versus that patient. It really has to be that different, that on the ground. The philosophical term would be naturalist or pragmatist. And as Tony puts it in an article he did in Climate Act Change in 2006, this research demonstrates that messages about climate change need to be tailored to the needs and predispositions of particular audiences, in some cases to directly challenge fundamental misconceptions, in others to resonate with strongly held values. So the variety of arguments can't be just we shift over to ecological utilization spaces or some of the other bigger arguments. It's going to be what is the broader toolbox of arguments that are going to work with particular different audiences in particular contexts. And the only way you figure that out is to do real empirical, and I want to say empirical philosophical research, right? There's a sort of a bad trend in philosophy of empirical work in philosophy, which involves you pull out a nifty philosophical puzzle like one we have is called the trolley problem. You're supposed to get to your intuitions on whether or not you think that killing is the same morally equivalent to letting die, or whether you're a consequentialist or non-consequentialist. It doesn't matter if you know this problem or not. And then you ask for a show of hands right in your intro class. That's not good data, right? We need really good data to get to this. We need to get to the bottom of this and have real, richly empirically formed work to do our clinical climate ethics. So this is the platform we're working on in this project, in the Climate Communication Project. What we propose is a web-based platform, 12,000 adults and 3,000 teenagers, that will, if we can get the full funding for it, will be around for 5 years. Right, we'll go for 5 years, which we can go back to every single month and do polling to find out how people's attitudes change with respect to the external conditions that affect them. Another Katrina-like event, the listing of some other critical species on the endangered species list, which we can tie to climate change, to the next treaty that comes down the pike from the UN, the Copenhagen Treaty, which will be decided next year, to this coming election, to the next major bill that goes through the Senate, on and on and on and on. You can get data on what people's attitudes are about climate change. You can also get reliable data to how this is changing people's behavior. So we're the first folks who are really proposing substantial polls to find out, are people switching out their light bulbs? Are people driving less? All these other kinds of things. And why are they doing that? Are they doing it because of some kind of moral motivation? Are they doing it because of resource constraints? Are they doing it because they have heard something or found something? And then it also gives us the ability for continuous experimentation. Clark comes up with a great argument, on a distributive justice version, right, of an argument on climate change, say relevant to the next major UN treaty. We put this in some form. It's either a message or a hypothetical newspaper article or a piece of hypothetical testimony before Congress, and we throw it up on this platform, and we see what kind of results he gets, and we see what kind of resistance he gets. And then we give it back to him and Clark now being the good clinical climate ethicist he's transformed himself into, right, says, here's how I tweak my argument to make it better, to resonate more with that audience. And that's the aspiration. We've raised enough money to run a pilot survey of survey of survey of survey of survey of survey of survey